Today, Sunday 15th September, we have the continuing repercussions in Britain of the talks in Washington between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and President Biden of the United States and their respective teams, when the British found themselves faced with an American refusal to their plan to use long-range missiles, Storm Shadow missiles, to carry out deep strikes inside Ukraine. Well, to be more precise, the British were saying that the Ukrainians would carry out the deep strikes with the Storm Shadow. The British supplied Storm Shadows against Russia. But of course, the Russians, for their part, President Putin himself, are saying that this can only be done with the direct involvement of the British. And as I've said in many places, this has not been contradicted, and Putin's words have not even been reported, or at least not properly reported, either in Britain or the United States, at least to the best of my own knowledge. But anyway, we're still hearing the reverberations of this, and there is clearly in London, I would suggest, significant embarrassment. And one of the reasons why I say that is because it's been fascinating to see how today, Sunday, all of the mainstream British media, all of the big newspapers, have simply stopped talking about this story, except, of course, one, which is the London Times, which has provided a detailed account, a very detailed account, one which has been the product, undoubtedly, of extensive briefing. Now, the title of this article is 5 ex-defense secretaries tell PM, let Ukraine fire our missiles. After talks in Washington reached a stalemate, Sir Keir Starmer is urged to go it alone. And then we're given the list of who these 5 former defence secretaries are. And by the way, an ex-Prime Minister, they're Grant Shapps, Ben Wallace, Gavin Williamson, Penny Mordaunt, Liam Fox, and of course, the ex-Prime Minister is Boris Johnson. And we have the usual mantras. Wallace said that failure to move now would make Britain appeasers of the Kremlin, whilst Williamson called it a dereliction of duty, and Johnson added, there is no conceivable case for delay. Appeasement, dereliction of duty, no conceivable excuse for delay. Well, what I can say about that is that, of course, all of these people were members of the outgoing government. If they'd wanted to give Ukraine the permission to launch Storm Shadow missiles, they could have done it, or at least so one might think. Except, of course, they could not, and Starmer cannot. And there are explanations for this. Further down in the article, there is a long explanation about the problems that the Storm Shadows, the British, would have if they simply granted the Ukrainians the permission to use the Storm Shadows without getting the agreement of the Americans and of the British. The government has repeatedly said they need the approval of both the United States and France before allowing Zelensky full use of the missiles. In fact, this is not absolutely correct, but it is practically true. Something which is practically true is absolutely correct. Let me just say this. In politics, something that is only notionally correct but is practically wrong is a nonsense. Something has to be both practical and notional before it can be correct. So anyway, just to say, I mean, we're getting some very strange English coming out of the media and Keir Starmer at the moment, but I don't want to dwell on that too long. Bluntly, Britain could fire Storm Shadows without US approval or assistance. Notice that the Times says Britain could fire Storm Shadows without US approval or assistance. They don't say Ukraine could fire Storm Shadows without US approval or assistance. A Freudian slip, a piece of poor editing, a quiet admission of the truth. Just mentioning this. But they might be intercepted by Russian air defences or be diverted off course. The missiles don't fly straight to their target, defence officials say. They are effectively threaded through the eye of a needle using GPS and terrain mapping data. You could absolutely fire it unilaterally, but it probably wouldn't survive in the contested, electronically jammed environment that the Russians have, a British defence source said. Russian electronic warfare has rendered GPS useless. They jam it, so it has to use another type of data set instead, which is American-owned. This is classified, but likely to be linked to the ground mapping capabilities. In fact, it goes beyond that. We know, because an article recently in the Daily Telegraph told us that the Storm Shadow uses American components and that it can only effectively penetrate Russian air defences. We're not even talking about electronic warfare systems here. We're talking specifically about the radars and missiles and all of those things, if they're accompanied by decoys, which only the United States produces. So the United States has an effective veto over the use of Storm Shadows by the British against Russia in Ukraine. Did I say the British? I should have said the Ukrainians, with the permission of the British. Just saying. Anyway, so these 5 British Defence Secretaries presumably know that, though maybe that might be an overestimate of the extent of their knowledge. Boris Johnson perhaps knows it too. When they say that this is appeasement, this is dereliction of duty, that there is no conceivable excuse for the British government not doing this now, they're either posing, undertaking a rhetorical exercise intended to put both themselves and their party, which is of course now in opposition, in a good light, or just possibly, in some cases, they don't know what they're talking about. I favour the earlier view that this is just a pose, because of course when they were defence secretaries they presumably knew about all of these constraints before, and that was why the Storm Shadows were not used against Russia previously. Just saying. Let me, by the way, make here a further point. Even if the British had the full capability, the decoys, the ground mapping systems, all of those things, which would have made it possible for the Ukrainians, and perhaps, according to the Russians, the British, to launch Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. I think the idea that the British could do such a thing without getting the agreement of the United States in advance is a fantastic one. The reality is that the relationship between the United States and Britain is not equal, whatever some British officials might like to think or pretend. Ever since the 1956 Suez Crisis, which demonstrated the inequality of the relationship starkly, and that inequality, by the way, has got much greater since then. Anyway, ever since then, every British government knows that it is simply not possible for Britain to go it alone in a venture like this without first getting the full agreement and support of the United States. Anyway, just to make that point completely clear. Anyway, Let's put all this aside, these technical points, the rather interesting language, the apparent admission that it will be the British launching the missiles against Russia. I, by the way, don't want to push that too far. I'm being a bit mischievous. I think that was probably an editing error, just saying. But anyway, let's put all that aside. Let's actually see what the Times, and as I said, it's clearly been carefully briefed, is telling us about the Washington talks. They say sources in London say there is a split in Biden's team between Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the dovish US National Security Advisor, who held Sherpa talks before the White House meeting with Tim Barrow, his opposite number. The problem is Sullivan, not Blinken, a British defence source said. All the way through, it has been Sullivan. And elsewhere in the article all but admits that the British were led along the nose by Blinken. Just to say, insiders, in other words, British officials, say the White House talks, which lasted 90 minutes, were very open about the choices ahead of us. Expressions like open, very open, can sometimes be a euphemism for a row. Perhaps that's not quite the meaning that we see here. But anyway, insiders say the White House talks, which lasted 90 minutes, were very open about the choices ahead of us, but it can be revealed that Biden and his team It can be revealed that Biden and his team signaled that they want to go into a holding pattern until Zelensky has presented his victory plan. The words holding pattern and victory plan are in quotation marks before giving their approval for attacks inside Russia. This surprised British officials who had listened closely to hints from Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, that America was edging towards authorizing Storm Shadow, an Anglo-French weapon which relies on American GPS guidance signals. So, the Times is telling us, exactly as Alex Christoforou and I said on the Duran, exactly as has been said on this channel, that Blinken was basically leading the British by the nose. That's what the Times tells us, and it's supposed to be based on insiders, in other words, British officials, and that it fell to Jake Sullivan, who's obviously the National Security Advisor, but also is somebody who's in very close contact with the Pentagon. Anyway, it fell to Sullivan specifically, and presumably the president, but the British are careful here to blame Sullivan rather than the president. Anyway, it fell to Sullivan at this meeting to say no. First of all, the Americans said, we want to see what Zelensky says. And until then, they're not prepared to make any kind of decision. And I'm going to go further, and I'm going to suggest that there are people in the United States, Sullivan, and the Pentagon, and people with the US intelligence community who have made clear to the British that this campaign that the British have launched on this issue has been deeply unwelcome in Washington. The Americans do not like being bounced into a decision like this. Certainly they do not like being bounced by the British. It's surprising that Keir Starmer was not briefed about this by his own officials, or perhaps he was and paid no attention to them. After all, Lord Darroch, the former National Security Advisor, has echoed the concerns of some Americans that this is, frankly, a bad idea which has not been properly thought through. Anyway, maybe they were briefed, maybe Starmer and the others, Lammy, Heaney, and all of those were briefed about this. They just paid no attention and steamrolled along thinking that they could get the Americans to agree, because Blinken also appeared to want to do this. And it looks as if this refusal that they came up with in Washington came as a shock. Well, unfortunately, as I said before, this is probably not now the end of the story. We read that a political source did not dispute that there were differences in Washington. I think it would be fair to say that Antony Blinken was leaning in that direction. However, there are hints that even if Biden is not prepared to publicly give the green light, he's willing to approve the use of US intelligence and targeting systems to accompany the Storm Shadow, which is jointly produced by Britain, France and Italy. Now, I have seen no indication that that is the case from any American source, but I suspect that this is indeed what the British are now trying to lobby for. And it's not conceivable that the Americans might agree. We're told that Starmer is not keen on this idea. He has been told that Starmer, while not explicitly committed to giving the green light, has faced down an attempt by the Foreign Office to get Britain to change its stance on Ukraine and get back in the pack. So the US is no longer the most forward-leaning member of the Western alliance in advocating the arming of Ukraine. That's a clear hint that the Foreign Office thinks that the British government here has gone off the rails and that they should pull back and that it's not a good idea to press forward with these plans. I said that maybe Starmer is not listening to his advisors, his officials. The Foreign Office apparently has been warning him that this is a bad idea. But then we're told that he is still keen to have an explicit US sign-off. A source close to the Prime Minister said this is something that he would want to do with key NATO allies aligned on the issue. And we're also told that a senior Tory familiar with Sullivan's views said he had been sceptical about Ukraine's ability to win the war since its outset in 2022. Well, that seems to me like an attempt to smear Sullivan. Anyway, there we are. So the British, led along by Tony Blinken, came to Washington thinking that they were going to get permission from the Americans to allow the Ukrainians or assist the Ukrainians in launching strikes with Storm Shadow missiles against Russia. The British government, Starmer and Lammy and the others, had been warned by the Foreign Office that they were going far too far ahead, that they weren't thinking it through, that there wasn't the support within NATO for this idea that they thought there was or wanted there to be, and that Britain risked going out on a limb. The British came to Washington. They came up against American opposition, and they're now blaming it all on Jake Sullivan, who is not going to be happy, by the way, to read these things about him which are appearing in the Times. So, a debacle on the part of the new government. It's inexperienced, it's absurdly aggressive. It seems to want to outdo, if anything, the previous Conservative government on the topic of Ukraine. It's finding that there is much stronger opposition in Washington than it expected, and it now finds itself being criticised as too dovish by its Conservative predecessors, who are, to say it bluntly, in my opinion, talking out of the sides of their mouths. They weren't able to do this when they were there. and they didn't apparently have plans to do this. And now they're talking about appeasement, dereliction of duty, and all that sort of thing. So one would like to believe, as I said, that Keir Starmer and his team will go away and think about what has just happened and will be more careful next time. But as I've said, more likely than not, they're going to press forward, they're going to agitate for this permission to be given, and they will try to get the Americans, perhaps not to agree explicitly, but to say, look, if you want to go ahead and do this, we're not going to stop you. We're only going to give you a small amount of help. We're going to give you the help we need, but we're not going to go out there and say so publicly. So if anything goes wrong, it will be all down to you. Which, again, I have to say, that seems to me a disastrous idea, and I can understand why Keir Starmer, who must be sensitive now that he's miscalculated on this one, why Keir Starmer is nervous about going down that route and finding himself isolated and out on a limb. Anyway, there we are. A fascinating article by the Times. Very interesting sometimes to see the curtain pulled and to get a sense of the kind of discussions that are taking place. But as I've said previously, this is a bad idea that never dies, and it's entirely possible that it could resurface again, perhaps when Zelensky comes to New York and the Americans meet him there. Zelensky has been providing everybody with plans of what he thinks allowing deep missile strikes in Russia might achieve. There's a map which has appeared in the London Times, which, to my mind, shows how minimal the distance, additional distance, over and above and beyond the HIMARS rockets that the Storm Shadows and even the ATACMS could travel. There's 1 or 2 air bases there. There's an oil refinery. There is, of course, the Kursk nuclear power plant, though I hope and believe that no one in Washington or London is thinking of launching missiles against that. Just saying. But anyway, there we are. We see how this is being presented by Zelensky. All of the operational plans and ideas that he's coming up with, it seems to me that all they do is bear out with accuracy of what Lloyd Austin said, that the launch of the missiles is not going to make any conceivable difference to the realities of the war. Now, before I leave this London Times article, I do want to go back to discussing what the Times actually said about the use of the Storm Shadows. The Times says that the Storm Shadow can't be launched against targets in Russia on the basis of GPS guidance because the Russians are successfully jamming GPS signals. And then it says this. So the Storm Shadow has to use another type of data set instead, which is American owned. This is classified but likely to be linked to the ground mapping capabilities. Now, I am not an expert in these matters, and perhaps I'm going far further than these words imply, but that rather looks to me like confirming the point that Putin made, that these missiles cannot be used without a direct input in terms of programming and preparation from Western technicians. And since we're talking about a data set that is American owned, in this case, it might even be American. Now, again, it may be that I'm getting this completely wrong. If so, people in the thread can confirm that. But I wonder once again whether the Americans are entirely happy about having a revelation like that appear in this article in the Times in a discussion of missile strikes against Russia. Anyway, let's leave this topic. We've got a few weeks now until the General Assembly meets in New York. Zelensky will come along with his plan, for such as it is, and we'll see what the Americans say, and we will see whether the British themselves learn any lessons from this affair, and we will see whether the very intense lobbying campaign that is now undoubtedly going to be unleashed in Washington is going to change the situation there in any way. As I said, we will just have to wait and see. In the meantime, I am going to make a point, which, by the way, and interestingly, has also been made by Group of Forces North, which is this. And in fact, I'm going to read what Group of Forces North have actually said about this. It shows how carefully the Russians are monitoring now everything that is being said in the West. It says that Kiev will not receive either Patriots or Tauruses. And in fact, the Netherlands has refused to provide a Patriot missile system. They're claiming that components for that system, which were to be provided by an unnamed third country, are not being provided. And for that reason, the Dutch have reconsidered their decision to supply this system. Olaf Scholz has again categorically rejected any supply of these long-range missiles, Taurus long-range missiles, to Ukraine. He's also made it clear that he's opposed to deep strikes against Russia with long-range missiles. The Italians, of course, are also opposed, and according to an article in Le Monde, the French authorities are also very queasy about this idea, and I'm guessing that Macron is in favour, but it seems that others within the French Defence Ministry are not, and it looks as if the plan has its opponents. The plan to launch long-range missile strikes has its opponents in France as well. So notice opposition in France, the United States, Germany. All of these countries have their doubters. Germany straightforwardly opposed, Italy straightforwardly opposed, France divided, the United States divided. Only the British really favour this idea of long-range missile strikes. And as I said, they are at very real risk, a bigger risk than perhaps they understand, of being left out on a limb if the Americans say no, or alternatively, if this plan goes ahead, but they are the only ones who are visibly executing it. So anyway, I digress. Let's go back to what Group of Forces North says. It says this: whilst Zelensky is fixated on the use of long-range missiles, requests for other weapons are gradually fading into the background. During this time, other Western curators have quietly reduced their assistance, and some are trying to disappear from the topic altogether. And then there is discussion about how the Netherlands is refusing to supply the Patriot system, and how Germany continues to refuse requests to supply the Taurus systems. And Group of Forces North concludes the long-range weapons that Zelensky is so focused on will not change the situation much. Kiev cannot win with a small number of missiles of this sort, and it will not get more because of the high cost. Simply put, the West is sorry to give its missiles to Ukraine to strike targets that Kiev can attack with its drones. Well, the last is debatable, actually. But the overall point, the point that Group of Forces North, that the Russians are making, that the Western powers are starting to reduce their support for Ukraine, is absolutely true. Not only has there been a significant reduction in weapons deliveries to Ukraine over the last couple of weeks, apparently the Biden administration took soundings in Congress to see whether Congress might be willing to pass another appropriation for funding Ukraine. Apparently the soundings were completely negative, and that idea has been dropped. So there's not going to be any sort of appropriation. The American media, I believe the Wall Street Journal specifically, says that whoever wins the presidency in the election in November is not likely to want to continue to support Ukraine to anything like the same level. We see the Germans cutting back. We see the French starting to cut back as well. The Italians. We see the IMF coming along, making extremely tough demands of the Ukrainians in terms of the kind of economic changes to economic policy that they want to see carried out in Ukraine. And the IMF, interestingly, is now offering to return to Russia and to start discussing with the Russians again the state of the Russian economy, with the IMF giving its so-called advice to the Russians. Advice which, by the way, the Russians have long since stopped paying much attention to. This was true even before the conflict in Ukraine began, just saying. But anyway, the point is, behind all the fire and thunder, behind all the dogmatic assertions of supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, the reality, especially given the situation on the battlefronts, is that Western enthusiasm for Project Ukraine is waning. The public, both in Europe and in the United States, is turning against this plan. In Europe, they're worried about economic problems. I suspect they are more worried about economic problems in the United States as well. Nobody wants to be overly associated with a project that is visibly failing, except, it seems, Keir Starmer and the new Labour cabinet. And in truth, if the Foreign Office is telling them to back off, to reconsider what they're doing, I think it's time that Keir Starmer and the Labour cabinet started listening properly to the advice of their diplomats. Anyway, there we are. This story, as I said, is not ended. I don't suppose I'll have any need to discuss it further over the next couple of days, though you never know. Let's wait and see what the next development is. Before I leave discussion of diplomatic matters, I should say that The Guardian, which is conspicuously not discussing the talks in Washington, the part of the talks in Washington that related to missile strikes on Russia, has instead decided to focus on growing alarm in Washington and London about deepening military cooperation between Iran and Russia. And in fact, Sergei Shoigu, the secretary of the Russian Security Council, has had further meetings with senior Iranian officials over the last 36 hours. And it's clear that the work on a major military deal between the Russians and the Iranians is moving forward. I've already talked about this. I've already said that the Israelis are nervous about it, that they sent a delegation to Moscow, purportedly to talk about hostage releases, but I am sure to probe what Russian intentions are. And this article in The Guardian gave us a very interesting insight on what the British and the Americans may be worried about. The British, along with the other major Western powers, issued another statement a few days ago criticizing Iran, complaining about Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, saying that Iran is enriching uranium to levels and in quantities far beyond anything that would logically be necessary. The article in The Guardian says that Iran now probably does have enough nuclear material to move rapidly to becoming a nuclear weapons state, but that it might lack the technology to convert that nuclear material quickly into a usable weapon. And according to The Guardian, part of the discussion between Starmer and Biden and their teams in Washington was about concerns that the Russians might assist the Iranians with that kind of capability. I think that is extremely unlikely myself. I don't believe that the Russians are ever in the business of nuclear proliferation. But then, of course, I don't know what the discussions between the Russians and the Iranians actually are. The Iranians, of course, continue to insist that they have no plans for the moment to develop a nuclear weapon. And for the record, I agree with them. But I will say this, given the tensions that have existed in the Middle East, if there was ever a time where there might have been some logic for Iran in acquiring a nuclear weapons capability or even a nuclear weapons arsenal, well, perhaps the most logical time to do that might be now. Israel has experienced a number of what the Iranians perceive as attacks upon themselves from Israel. Their embassy building in Damascus was attacked. Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran. There have been other incidents as well, which I'm not going to discuss at this point. As I've said in various programs, the rhetoric coming from Israel about Iran has been extremely hardline. The Iranians have discovered that their missile strike that they conducted back in April has not restored deterrence. They are re-equipping themselves, apparently, with Russian weapons, but it may be that there is some lobby group in Tehran that's now saying, well, look, the only way that we can, in fact, achieve a genuine deterrence capability is by going nuclear in the way that our friends, the North Koreans, did. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm not saying that's what's actually happening. I think it is, as I said, all but inconceivable that the Russians are directly involved in anything of that kind, though the Iranians might be seeking advice from their North Korean friends who undoubtedly, well, who probably have fewer inhibitions on this score than the Russians do, just saying. But anyway, it was an interesting piece in The Guardian. I don't think it was just a scare story about Iran. I think it speaks to a genuine concern, but one which, like all of these other issues, if it's true, it's American and Western policy that has largely brought it about. Anyway, there we are. Let's now go back to the conflict in Ukraine, because all kinds of serious and dramatic things are now happening on the battlefronts. And let's begin with the situation in the area of Vuhledar. The last we heard, the Russians were storming the two coal mines, South Donbass number 1, which is located northeast of Vuhledar, and South Donbass number 3, which is located between the villages of Odyanye and Bogoyavlenka. In fact, as I understand it, it is closer to Bogoyavlenka than it is to Vodyanye. Vodyanye now being firmly under Russian control. Well, we've been getting reports this morning from the Russians, or at least from not Russian official channels, but from Russian reporting channels, which do seem to be fairly well informed about the situation in the battle, in the fight for these two coal mines, and they're telling us the same thing. They are saying that the Russians have basically cleared both coal mines, but that there are still some Ukrainian troops holding out in a few places in each of them, and that the other major problem that the Russians have is that both coal mines are heavily covered with mines and booby traps, and that the fact that these mines and booby traps are all over the place is slowing and complicating Russian military operations in terms of clearing these two coal mines. And I think this is correct, and I strongly suspect that it will take probably the Russians some days to clear both of these coal mines, but ultimately they will. And maybe towards the end of this coming week, we will learn that both of the coal mines have indeed come fully under Russian control, and we'll be seeing the Russian soldiers raising their flags over the coal mines and their surrounding slag heaps, at which point Vuhledar will be cut off and surrounded, and there will be, well, no prospect from that point onwards of a relief of the garrison there, if the Ukrainian command makes the tragic and disastrous mistake of leaving it there. Logically, as I've said, the Ukrainians ought to be pulling their troops out of Vuhledar, and they ought to be doing it now. Obviously, that would mean abandoning Vuhledar to the Russians, but far more important, to save the men and whatever machines can be saved, war machines, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and those sort of things can be saved, than to sacrifice them pointlessly in a battle for a town which the Russians are going to capture eventually anyway. I would have thought this is obvious, both from a military and a humanitarian point of view. I'm afraid I don't think that is what the Ukrainians, Zelensky, Siersky, and all the other commanders in this area are going to do. By the way, on that point, I do wonder who the overall Ukrainian officer who is commanding operations in the Pokrovsk area actually is. He has been systematically outplayed by General Mordvichev on the Russian side. He does have the excuse that he's short of men and machines. We've seen the articles in the BBC and CNN and other places that I've discussed in recent programs. The BBC articles are now, by the way, I noticed, starting to attract a significant amount of attention. So whoever the Ukrainian officer is who's running things in this part of the battlefront is doing so playing with a very weak set of cards, and I think that fact has to be acknowledged. But even then, and even allowing for that, it does seem to me that serious mistakes are being made, precisely as those Ukrainian soldiers who spoke to the BBC, whom I discussed yesterday, are saying. And I'm afraid the sacrifice of the men defending Vuhledar is going to be another one of these mistakes. Anyway, elsewhere, we have further news confirming from the Ukrainians that their troops in Ukrainsk are in effect surrounded. I say troops in Ukrainsk. It's not clear to me that they are actually in the residential area of Ukrainsk. They could be in the coal mine and slag heap to the west of Ukrainsk or northwest of Ukrainsk, I don't know. But wherever they are, it looks as if the Russians have them in some kind of operational encirclement. The Ukrainians are trying to get these troops out, but the Russians have surrounded them, and it's not quite a cauldron. There are still gaps through which perhaps the Ukrainians could escape, but it'll be difficult. And anyway, the Ukrainians are having to conduct what I suspect are costly counterattacks to try to create an open route for the Ukrainian troops in Ukrainsk to escape through. And once again, and going back to what that Ukrainian officer said to the BBC, if the Ukrainian troops in Ukrainsk had been pulled out of the town a couple of days ago, well, again, the town would have been abandoned to the Russians and the Russians would have occupied it. But the Ukrainians, who by their own admission are desperately short of men in this area, would have preserved the lives of more of their men who might perhaps possibly be in a position to fight another day. Just saying. So anyway, Ukrainsk, certain to fall. The only question is whether for the Russians the priority is to take control of Ukrainsk, in which case they might actually take steps to allow the Ukrainians to leave, or on the contrary, to destroy the Ukrainian soldiers who are probably now trapped in the coal mine and slag heap to the northeast of Ukrainsk. Now, yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that Zelanye Pershe, the village to the east of Ukrainsk, the southeast of Ukrainsk, is now firmly under Russian control. And there are reports that the Russians are moving south from that village and are now storming the village of Zelanye Druha, which is located immediately to the south. So that's the news from the Ukrainsk sector of the battlefronts. There are also reports that the Russians are continuing to make progress in the Selidovo area. It's not particularly clear what's going on. And the Russians continue to bomb and shell Pokrovsk itself. And they seem to be intent on cutting off, or at least obstructing, the communications to this important town, which is of course also itself a communications hub, a major supply hub for the Ukrainian forces elsewhere in Donbass. And it seems that the Russians have destroyed several road bridges, and that will interfere with the movement of supplies, not just for the garrison of Pokrovsk, but for the garrisons in other places, Chasov Yar, Toretsk, and such places. And, well, the supply situation for the Ukrainians is getting worse and worse. And, by the way, on the topic of the fighting and the Ukrainian lack of supplies and equipment, and returning briefly to the fighting near Vuhledar and to the Russian storming operation of the coal mine, South Coal Mine number 3, the one between Vodyane and Bogoyavlenka. The Russians have now produced some very vivid film of the assault, and it shows infantry fighting vehicles, Russian infantry fighting vehicles. I'm told, by the way, that they are BMP-3s, which are the absolute top of the line Russian infantry fighting vehicles, which suggests that we're talking here about an attack carried out by mechanized units of the regular Russian army, or possibly Russian naval infantry who also use this very advanced infantry fighting vehicle. But anyway, you could see 3 of these infantry fighting vehicles, Russian infantry fighting vehicles, smash into the industrial buildings in the coal mine. And the striking thing was there was no sign of any Ukrainian resistance. The Ukrainian soldiers there might still be some of them, maybe on the slag heap. There may be problems with mines and booby traps. But as far as I could tell, there was no attempts made to resist the advance of these Russian armoured vehicles whatsoever. And that seems to me to be the story right across the battlefronts. Ukrainians are very short now of artillery, of ammunition, of armour. They are operating increasingly as light infantry, using, in some ways, ordinary civilian passenger cars to try to move around. And their ability to withstand advances by Russian armour appear to be reducing all the time. Now, I mention all of this because there's been some speculation, not on several places actually, about a potential Ukrainian counterattack against Russian positions in Novogrodovka, supposed Ukrainian attempts to recapture the 2 slag heaps to the north of Novogrodovka, and perhaps to take parts of Novogrodovka again back under Ukrainian control. If the Ukrainians are short of men and short of artillery and short of armour, how are they going to conduct a counterattack like that? If they do try and conduct that kind of counterattack, they're going to suffer massive losses of the little of what they have left, and they're going to weaken their positions even more. Or so it seems to me. The entire narrative about a Ukrainian counterattack being prepared in this area appears to me to be based on the fact that the Russians have been releasing lots of films of drone attacks with Russian drones on Ukrainian vehicles, mainly light-skinned vehicles, trucks in this area. And some people are seeing this as evidence of some kind of Ukrainian build-up in the area. It seems to me a more plausible explanation, and again, I'm not there, so I might be completely wrong, but a more plausible explanation is that what the Russians are doing is attacking Ukrainian forces located to the north and northwest of Novogrodivka in advance of their own offensive in precisely this area. So, anyway, just saying. Now, there were lots of reports about Ukrainian troops being left behind in the fields around Nivolskoye. If that is true, then the Russian capture of Zhelanye Pershe has probably doomed these men to encirclement and capture or destruction. I can't really see how the Ukrainian troops can now escape from these fields. As that Ukrainian soldier was telling the BBC in that article that I discussed yesterday, keeping the Ukrainian troops there merely because this is a field relatively close to Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, that this is where some of the Ukrainian artillery was based. Keeping the Ukrainian troops there was a terrible mistake. And it looks as if any general withdrawal from this area, which apparently has never happened, has now been left too late, and these troops will presumably, I don't know how many there are, probably no more than a couple of hundred, but these troops will probably all be taken into captivity fairly soon. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation in the Ukrainsk area. The Russians making progress in Selidovo as well, by the way, though hardly dramatic progress. To repeat what Radovka said, I think that the major objectives of the Russians are to capture Ukrainsk, Girnik, probably another village called Izmailivka, Zelanye Drucha, and then to move on to capture Tsukurinye. I'm probably pronouncing the name of that village wrongly, by the way. And then, with the road fully cleared, the main supply road from Donetsk fully cleared, the Russians can wrap up the Battle of Selidovo, which I suspect is what we will probably see happen at some point within the next few weeks. And probably at the end of this month, the assault on Pokrovsk will then begin in earnest, with the road cleared, Selidovo, Grodivka, Novogrodivka, all of those other villages captured, and the way open for the Russian assault on Mirnograd and Pokrovsk itself. Now, there's been no news, as far as I know, about the situation in Toretsk. Most likely, the Russians are continuing to advance in Toretsk. As I've said many times, the fact that we're not getting any news from someplace doesn't mean that important things are not happening. But we are getting quite a lot of news now from the Chasov Yar area, and it looks as if the situation in Chasov Yar, very much as I have predicted, is becoming, for the Ukrainians, extremely serious indeed. Firstly, it's apparently mostly confirmed that the Russians have indeed cleared the fields between Klishayevka and the Seversky Donets aqueduct. The Ukrainians took a decision to pull back from the area east of the aqueduct. It's clear that they had no realistic choice but to do so. And there are now reports that the Russians have advanced in this area west of the aqueduct, positioning them to outflank Chasov Yar from the south, or to begin an assault on Chasov Yar from the south. But they're also positioned, strongly positioned now, to launch a direct attack on the city of Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka and Klishayevka are almost on the same latitude as each other. So it's an almost straight line from Klishayevka to Konstantinovka. Of course, if Chasov Yar falls, the Russians will control the high ground as well. So one could say that we are looking at the beginning, or at least the first stages, in what could be a battle for Konstantinovka as well. And elsewhere, there's lots of reports now that the Russians, having captured Grigorivka to the north of Kalinina, that they're now pushing their forces in numerous places west of the aqueduct to the north of Chasov Yar, and that they're going to start soon an outflanking move of the Ukrainians in Chasov Yar from the north as well. So Chasov Yar is starting to be taken into pincers. There's a pincer assault developing in Chasov Yar. And by the way, there's also pictures that have appeared showing at least some Russian soldiers in what look to me now like the central parts of Chasov Yar, also west of the canal. I repeat what I've said. I think that the battle for Chasov Yar is now entering its closing stages. Probably the battle for Konstantinovka will begin soon after. If everything I've heard about the elevations, the fact that Chasov Yar is on a higher place, it's on a hill overlooking Konstantinovka is true, with the Russians having crossed the aqueduct east of Konstantinovka, it could very well be that perhaps in November, December, the Russian assault on Konstantinovka will begin, with Chasov Yar possibly by that point having already been captured. Now, there is lots of news also coming from the Kupiansk area, and this is one of the most complicated and in some ways mysterious battles of all, because it looked for a time, as I remember last year, as if the Russians were prioritizing their offensive in Kupiansk, and then the Russians reached a village called Sinkovka, close to Kupiansk, stopped. Then they reactivated this part of the front some weeks ago. About 10 days ago, we got reports that the Russians had captured Sinkovka, and that seems indisputable. They then advanced south, and we now have confirmation. In fact, there's been pictures and film. Apparently, I haven't seen it, but apparently there's been pictures and film which show that the Russian troops have entered a village called Petropavlivka, which is located immediately to the west of Kupiansk. If Petropavlivka falls to the Russians, then looking at the situation, it seems to me that the defense of Kupiansk will quickly collapse. Kupiansk is, of course, bisected by the Oskol River. Apparently, the Russians occupy an important village to the south called Pishanye and have been advancing north and west of Pishanye. You can actually, it's a village, Pishanye is a village just southeast of Petropavlivka. If the Russians are in all of these places, then it seems to me that the best thing that the Ukrainians can do at this time is to pull back from at least the eastern part of Kupiansk, pull their troops back to the west bank of the Oskol River, and begin a delaying action there for as long as they can. I doubt that they will be able to hold their positions, by the way, in Kupiansk for very long, but obviously this is the area of Ukraine's successful offensive of the autumn of 2022, the so-called Kharkiv offensive. Quite plausibly, the Ukrainians will want to hold on to Kupiansk and all of this territory, again, more for image and prestige reasons than anything else. If the Russians capture Kupiansk, they can probably push west towards Balaklia, Izium, all of these places. They might rapidly fall back under Russian control. Now, further south, not far, in fact, from the village, or rather the small town of Liman, which the Russians also held for a relatively small time in the summer of 2022, but which the Ukrainians captured over the course of their autumn 2022 counteroffensive. Anyway, in that general area, it looks as if the Russians have completed the battle for Makeyevka, small village on the Zherebets River, bitterly fought over, and there are reports that the Russians have now not only crossed the Zherebets River in this area, this has been, I think, fairly well established for some time, but that they've significantly enlarged their bridgehead in this area. And if that is correct, then it looks to me as if we can probably anticipate a Russian attack south towards Torske, the next village on the Zherebets River. There was a lot of fighting there in the spring. Many people claimed that the Ukrainians won a victory there. I was always skeptical, but anyway. But more importantly, with the Russians on the west bank, well established on the west bank of the Zherebets River, almost certainly they'll be able to push on, or so I would have thought, towards Liman. And if one looks at this general area, the Russians are now likely to be advancing towards Liman, towards Kupiansk, and they are located, as I've discussed in many programs, close to Siversk, another town in this general area. The Russians have been giving this territory less priority until fairly recently, but I'm going to suggest that once the battles for Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, Korakhovo, Selidovo, and all the others are resolved, we will see a major Russian advance. Perhaps later this year, start of this year, at the end of this year, start of next year, precisely in the Liman, Siversk, Kupiansk, Izium area. And that will then set the scene for a major battle, the last major battle of the war, as I expect, which will be the battle for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which I expect will happen perhaps in the first half of 2025. If all of the rest of this territory is captured by the Russians, it's very difficult for me to see how the Ukrainians can hold on to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And, well, once these places fall, the Russians will be able quickly to establish control all the way to the Dnieper. And, of course, they can advance towards the Dnieper from Pokrovsk. And as I've discussed many times, if the Russians reach the Dnieper in central Ukraine, it is an existential moment for Ukraine. It's very difficult to see how Ukraine can continue with the Russians located, in effect, in the economic heart of Ukraine. And with the Ukrainian army defeated, I suspect that at that stage, events will rapidly accelerate, assuming, of course, that there's any resistance left by Ukraine at that time. Reports are saying, by the way, that the Ukrainians are also informing the US that they believe that the Russian plan is to win the war in the first half of 2025. Of course, the Ukrainians are saying that the Russians need to do that because they're anticipating massive problems in their economy in December 2025. Why the Ukrainians think that the Russian economy will be in difficulties in December 2025, I have no idea. I suspect it's another one of these over-optimistic hopes about the state of the Russian economy. There is no information or evidence coming out from Russia that supports that particular theory. On the contrary, all the theory is of high investment rates, industrial and manufacturing growth, a strengthening of the Russian economy rather than a weakening of it. more likely the Ukrainians are spinning this story in that way because they deep down understand that the crisis point in the war is approaching, crisis point for them, and they're hoping that they can persuade the Americans and the Europeans to stay the course and to rescue them from the catastrophe that they will be facing over the next 6 to 12 months. And they're spinning this story about a Russian economic collapse in December 2025 in order to give the Western powers some hope that if they continue to stand by Ukraine, things will turn out for the best eventually. Well, there we go. That's it seems to me where we are on the battlefronts as of now. I've not discussed in detail the situation in Kursk region, but I'll just do a very quick wrap up. Ukraine has made, it seems, a major attempt to try to break through the Russian positions towards the village of Veselye in Glushkovo region. This is some kind of an attempt to outflank the Russians, who are, of course, currently busy advancing deeper into the Ukrainian enclave in Kursk region. The general consensus from all reporters of the fighting in this area is that this attempt by the Ukrainians has been unsuccessful, that the Russians have been able to successfully contain this attack. And there is still some uncertainty as to what is going on in Lyubimovka, whether the Ukrainians are still defending that village. But group of forces north say that the Russians have advanced a further 2 kilometers in their counterattack in Kursk. And there are also reports that the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk region, rather like the Ukrainian forces in the Pakrovsk region, are now critically short of armor. And anyway, one way or the other, the whole Ukrainian offensive in Kursk is starting to look as if it might be on the last legs. I read an interesting report, by the way, in Redovka yesterday, which said that the rains are expected to begin in Kursk region in about 2 weeks' time. At that point, movement across open ground in Kursk region is going to become all but impossible. The Ukrainians will therefore be confined to the roads. The Russian drones control the roads. In one of the 2 articles I discussed yesterday, there were reports about how the air, one of the Ukrainian soldiers was describing how the sky above Kursk is buzzing with Russian drones. So the Russians see everything, know everything, can attack everything. They're in a position to attack any Ukrainian movements along the roads in the shortest possible time. It's quite likely that communications will collapse in 2 weeks' time, and apparently the Russians are storming now Ukrainian positions southeast of Sudzha. They're very close to Sudzha. There's more reports that the Russians have captured the village of Borki and are preparing to attack and recapture the village of Plechovo, directly south of Sudzha. Plechovo, by the way, is also on the border with Ukraine. There's apparently a checkpoint there, a border post there. Anyway, the point is that it looks to me as if it's not implausible that in a few weeks' time, the Ukrainian enclave in Kursk will be reduced to Suja itself. And given the likely difficulties in movement that are going to start to develop in Kursk region over the next few weeks, it's almost certainly a militarily good idea for the Ukrainians to pull out of Kursk now. Of course, if they'd been listening to me, they would have pulled out of Kursk back in August, when their objective, the objective that people like Sergei Shoigu, General Alaudinov, various other Russian officials say they had, and the objective which I am convinced they had, which is the Kursk nuclear power station, when it became confirmed that it was out of reach. Anyway, there we are. An interesting 24 hours. Situation on the battlefronts continues. Again, to repeat once more, I think that many Western commentators are in denial about the realities on the battlefronts. I was reading a very interesting and long discussion of the situation on the battlefronts and in the diplomatic battle by Mark Urban, British commentator, writing again in the London Times. He spoke about how both Ukraine and Russia might be keen on negotiations about this time. Like many people, Mark Urban, who I remember, by the way, writing notably level-headed and factual accounts of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan way back in the 1980s. Anyway, he appears still, as many others do, to imagine a kind of equivalence in striking power between the two armies. He takes, for example, as true British claims about Russian losses, which I am convinced, in fact I have no doubt, are wildly inflated, but he assumes that they must be correct. The possibility that they might be wrong never occurs to him. He also continues to cling on to the theory that the New York Times story of a few weeks ago, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were on the brink of a meeting in Qatar to agree a ceasefire, a mutual ceasefire on their respective drone and missile attacks on each other's energy systems. Anyway, he takes it as read that those reports were true, again, ignoring the fact that every single Russian official, including, by the way, Ambassador Polyansky, who Glenn Deason and myself interviewed, every single Russian official has denied the New York Times account and report about those talks. Anyway, far too many people, I think, continue to believe that there is some sort of rough balance or equivalence or equilibrium between the two armies. That might have been true even last year, even at this time last year, when the Ukrainian offensive basically petered out, though even then it was obvious to me that the pendulum of advantage was swinging strongly in the Russians' favour. It is certainly not true now. A year of aggressive attrition, which the Russians have conducted ever since then, has reduced Ukraine's army to a disastrous, threadbare state, where it is short of men, where it's short of armour and machines, where it's, as those reports that I discussed yesterday all but admitted, reduced to trying to plug holes along the enormously long contact line, where the Russians are attacking continuously in every place at once, where the Ukrainians are getting more tired, more exhausted, where their equipment levels are falling, and where the provision of Western military aid as Group of Forces North confirmed is starting to run down, or claim is indeed starting to run down. So there is no equivalence between the two armies at this time. None of the problems, equipment problems, shortages of men, all of that we have been hearing about from the Ukrainian side apply to the Russian side to anything like the same degree. And of course, the economic situation, the economic condition of the two sides could not be more different. So there is no equivalence, there is no equilibrium, there is no stagnation on the front lines or anything like that. There is likely, on the contrary, to be a collapse at some point in the next 6 to 10 months. That might even be an optimistic estimate from a Ukrainian point of view. But there is likely to be that collapse. Unless, as George Beebe correctly suggested, diplomatic action is undertaken urgently to prevent it. All of this talk about long-range missiles is simply a distraction from that underlying reality which far too many people are still in denial about. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video, and of course you can also check out our shop. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.